So as I was just saying, here to commence the first of these big dinners, the theme for this evening is the adjacent possible. I have some interesting people, all friends and collaborators of the Voicecraft context. We've shared many hours of dialogue together here this evening or this morning. We have Tom, Simon, Aspasia, and Cadell. Now, Simon, I've really enjoyed getting to know over these last couple of years. For those of you who don't know him, he's got a background in microbiology, but he's been exploring what it means to authentically build a life and relationships and offer value on a shamanic path. So what does shamanism mean today? We also have Aspasia, who's a clinical psychologist. It's lovely to welcome you. She's been a core part of the Voicecraft context for a number of years now. We have Tom, who is a difficult person to introduce, but in general, I find to be one of the most insightful, capable people to participate in understanding with, to be totally honest. So it's always an absolute honor to be present with Tom. And Cadell is a real treat. Cadell's the founder of Philosophy Portal, and I consider Cadell to be genuinely one of the most insightful, powerful philosophers and philosophical educators alive today, which is actually a wild thing to say, but that's what I think. So it's awesome to welcome Cadell. We've got many dialogues on the channel and around the place together. So these are some introductions. Thank you for bearing with me. As I was mentioning, the theme for this evening is the adjacent possible. It's a notion introduced by Stuart Kaufman. Very simply put, it asks us to consider what that next available step is in the context of creation, right? We look around, what affordances are there for us? One might think as soon as various developments were made in physics or in different disciplines of technology, and all of a sudden different kinds of inventions become possible. Different things can be thought which previously could not have been. So we might consider, in the context of meeting new people or developing trust, what kinds of possibilities open to us. There's many ways to look at it. It's really quite simple. And yet, really relating with who we are, where we are, what it's possible to do, how to connect with what is real in our time and what our affordances for action are in the context of our present world, in the context of our networks, in the context of our economy. Well, all of that opens up many questions. So I want to ask Cadell, just to open. Cadell's an author of a number of books. One of them is called Systems and Subjects. And Cadell, without needing to delve too deeply into all of that work, the one piece from a very broad perspective I wanted to invite you to share your thoughts on is the meaning of system. You know, how do you think about the system that we participate in today? What is a system? And maybe from that perspective, we can get a sense of what are the beginnings of what our affordances for connection and possibility for relating and building together are in this time.
Well, thanks for having me, Tim, and great to be here. I spent a lot of time thinking about the adjacent possible yesterday after your helpful email framing the opening of this event, and great to be here. Okay, so starting with systems and subjects then before getting into the adjacent possible, I think the only thing I want to say about systems and subjects is that book was based on and inspired by Hegel's axiom, the absolute is substance but also subject. We could also say the absolute is system but also subject. And so I'm just thinking basically about a feedback loop between systems and subjects. Like, we don't want to have a view of systems that are universal in general, but have no room for subjectivity. But we also don't want to have a view of subjectivity that's too particular and leaves out our understanding of the universal and the general. And it's very difficult to combine both of those views. So, for example, I remember when I was presenting the ideas for this book for the first time, and I was at a system science institute, and one person from the audience said, "You're being too scientific and not spiritual enough." And then another person said, "You're being too subjectivist, you're not being scientific enough." And so you can't, just an example of like the way I was feeling when I was exploring these ideas for the first time is that, when you really try to combine these 2 points of view, people who are oriented in one direction or another are going to be turned off by the approach. Basically, it's like I actually had a podcast a few days ago where I was talking about this. Systems and subjects, it's basically like a feedback loop between subject and object. You could think about it like that, and that you're thinking about them as a unity. I know you guys, or a lot of people here, are inspired by Vervaeke's cognitive science, and I think he's trying to get at something quite similar with the idea of I think, correct me if I'm wrong, the transjective, where the subject and object are seen as a unity. And I'm basically going for something similar to that. In terms of what I was inspired by yesterday, thinking about the adjacent possible and how to approach this, I think a lot about, and more this year, but it's always been a part of my work. I think a lot about the capitalist system, or capitalism as a system, and how that system impacts us as subjects, and perhaps like the starting point for that in a lot of the political tradition is either our role as wage laborers or our valuation as a capital accumulation, profit maximization. These dimensions are our life and how they dominate us, or how they, either exploit us or totalize us. And then I was thinking, so I want to use a few examples of the capitalist system in regards to these ideas of the adjacent possible, and also juxtapose an alternative concept that might be interesting. So I was just breaking down the concept of the adjacent possible, or when I was, looking up basic things about the adjacent possible. The first thing is that we're thinking about adjacent, something next to, something adjoining, something just next door, so to speak. And then possible, something able to be done. And I wanted to share with this audience, maybe it's something that's interesting, is I felt like the first thing is the adjacent possible seemed to me to be a very practical concept. And then I immediately thought about what are the opposites of the adjacent and what is the opposites of the possible. For me, the opposite of adjacent would be remote, far away, not adjacent, not right next to, but far away. And then something impossible, something not able to be done. And I think that when we think about politics, and specifically when we think about capitalism, oftentimes it becomes very difficult to think about the adjacent possible, and very easy to become overwhelmed with what's impossible and what seems very remote. And I think we can get a lot of political despair for this reason. So the concept that I've been playing with, mostly because Slavoj Žižek just released a book called Quantum History, is the idea of superposition. And the idea of the superposition, and that's the main thing I wanted to throw, or to ask you guys and to maybe stimulate conversation, is the relationship between the adjacent possible and superposition. Because the superposition contains the entire space of possibilities. It's not just what's next to, or it's not just what you think right now is able to be done, but what might be able to be done, but right now seems remote, or right now seems impossible. And so this brings me to what I was thinking about yesterday, just with various people talking to me. So one of my friends and collaborators, Dimitri Kroimans, he goes to all of these different political events in Amsterdam. He works for a right-wing organization, and then he goes to a left-wing organization, and he's just trying to feel out the entire political space of possibility. Like, what's the adjacent possible for the contemporary right? what's the adjacent possible for the contemporary left in regards to the system of capitalism? And he is picking up this zeitgeist, which is that the populist right today is very much alive, meaning the populist right has a lot of energy behind it, especially for young men. And that the left wing, the more socialist end of things, he told me yesterday, just seems dead, just seems lethargic. And I think that the reason why the right today feels so alive and the left today feels so dead is because there's something going on in the right that's closer to the adjacent possible. And there's something about the left that is still wrestling with something that currently seems impossible, that seems far off, that seems remote, but might actually be possible. It's just about what steps might we want to take within our current adjacent possible that would make that impossibility possible 2 years, 3 years, 4 years down the line. And the two symbols that I've been, or the two signifiers that I've been playing with the most is, and kind of trying to revive from the 20th century, is the distinction between national and international socialism. And namely, the idea of socialism and the way in which socialism fragments between a national variant and an international variant. And what does that difference mean? And why does the right find itself more aligned with a national socialism? And why does that seem adjacent possible right now? Why is that next door? Why is that close by? And why is international socialism something that seems impossible, something remote, something far away? So those are kind of, I could go on with those things, but that's kind of what I've been tracking. And so, like, just to rehash, I'm thinking about capitalism as a system, and I'm basically seeing the adjacent possible as a very practical concept to explore what's the next step. But I want to play with the opposite of the concept because I feel like humans, there's only a part of humans that is on a day-to-day level very practical. You know, Zizek has this line that says, pragmatism is great. Pragmatism sounds great in theory, but in practice, human beings are very impractical. You know, and I think that, at least speaking for myself, sometimes I can get caught up in what seems remote and far away and what seems impossible today. And so and also in terms of, you know, juxtaposing the adjacent possible as a concept versus the concept of a superposition. What is the superposition of the capitalist system? Like, what is possible within the capitalist system, but seems impossible today? And that opens up big questions to me about socialism. And then the final thing I'll say is that in some of the popular writings about the adjacent possible, authors have called it like a shadow future hovering over the edge of the present. And I think the idea of superposition is just that it casts a way bigger shadow. Like, it's like if the adjacent possible is the shadow future hovering over the edge of the present state, then the superposition is like this just enormous shadow hovering over time itself or something like that. Like, and what are all of the possibilities within time itself, and specifically within the systems that are currently actual.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you, Cadell. That's an awesome opening. You know, this brings to mind questions of intuition, of non-linearity. What is it to make leaps? All these sorts of things. Now, with a little mind for time, we'll take another sort of 10, max 15 minutes before we conclude this first part and break out for dinner. I want to ask Simon next, because Simon, one of the possibilities, one of the initial framings we had for this first big dinner was maybe where are we limited today, which in some respects is looking to bite into the same general orientation. It has a little bit more of a, on the face of it, negative spin, but really for the sake of opening up again what our possibilities are, what might be enabling constraints. Now, you shared something, a very beautiful set of reflections about your view of the present in terms of where you find yourself to be frustrated and limited with respect to how you see the world today. You don't have to necessarily recapitulate all of that. There was just something important, I think, in the spirit of that, which feels relevant today. You're welcome to pick up on anything that's coming through for you. So, how do you meet this invitation of the adjacent possible?
Thanks for that. And thanks, Cadell. The superposition immediately sparked an image for me. As always, I'm going to feel into like a biological metaphor about limits. I'm going to use the metamorphosis of the caterpillar into the butterfly as an example of a switch, maybe a superposition between two systems. So an organismal pattern of the caterpillar is a limiting pattern if one is looking to become a butterfly, which seems impossible. The caterpillar is a soft exterior body insect, while the butterfly is a hard exterior body. The organs of the caterpillar are quite different than the organs in the butterfly, even though the biological material and the cells are exactly the same. So in that transition period between caterpillar and butterfly, there seems to be necessarily complete dissolution of the caterpillar. So a complete unwinding of the gestalt of the image that has captured the biological material that puts it in a shape. The caterpillar has to sort of spin its own tomb, its own cocoon. So a place to go into dissolution and a place to die, while keeping the individual cells alive and maybe the organs alive. And there's this talk about imaginal cells. So cells that have already carry the pull from the future, already carry or court the image of the butterfly. So you can imagine that you have this caterpillar which has acquired mass. I often see the capitalist system as one that is mainly focused at acquiring mass, and then has to go into a state of gestation, has to spin from its own material, create a space of immobility. And in that immobility, it has to start dissolving. So it has to dissolve the bonds between cells. So it's not dissolving the individual cells, but between cells. So mobility is reintroduced. And then all the image of the butterfly has to be sort of anchored, while the image of the caterpillar has to be let go of. And then all these individual cells can be called into formation to form the new organs, and the new organs together form the butterfly. And then there's, of course, a struggle to get out of the cocoon. And this struggle seems to be necessary for the butterfly to be a successful butterfly, as in be a viable living organism that can fly and can do what a butterfly wants. If I then put that into the perspective of me as an individual and maybe other individuals as the collective, I'm very interested in what parts of me are operating on the image of the caterpillar, and what parts of me are operating on the image of the butterfly. For me, it feels like we are in a transitionary or liminal space where the human as an organism is really being asked to step into a different role. It's like the climate is shifting. If we look really seriously at what is happening on the planet, I think we're heading to a completely different state, not a stable state. We're in the transitionary period, but the planet is going to look very different, and that it's asking a lot of adaptational capacity. If I look at myself as an individual, it's like I incarnate into a bloodline which is a meeting of two people, which is a meeting of two bloodlines. They carry a lot of programming. And here is what Cadell mentioned. What I really like is the recursive loop between a subject and a system. You can see the system as the programming or the model of a certain organism. So you're being pressed into a culture, which is also a template for a certain form of way of being. So my parents have been living in a certain culture, and their parents are coming from the Second World War in Europe, for instance. So all these states of upheaval. And that imprints certain behaviors and certain expected behaviors, survival strategies, and those live in those grandparents, those live in those parents, and those live in me. And so there's this meeting, and now I'm at the nexus of those, and those patterns are alive in me, those survival strategies, those patterns. And in my practice, I call it healing or holing, making whole. And for me, holing involves mainly integration of many disparate, different patterns, which are all aligned and maybe stuck in different pasts, different environments in which they evolved to survive. But now the environment has changed, and it feels like the process of becoming an individual, but becoming a wholly integrated individual that can be aligned with whatever is this other, this maybe this new system, this other image, what is the adjacent possible system that we can court into being, because this recursive loop is also not passive. I think the more we align with imaginal cells, let's say, the more we align with that interior sense of like what is wanting to come into presence, it becomes more real. And in that anchoring into the physical, we anchor that image of the butterfly more. And as it's more anchored in the physical, we also allow all these programs to dissolve or adapt to whatever is being asked. So for me, the image very much comes up. It's a courtship. It's a courtship of the adjacent possible. And I mean courtship in the sense that it's a communication, and it's not we can idealize a certain system, build it in the here and now, and then just fully align at that. Because I think that will probably, can the caterpillar even know what a butterfly is? Most likely not. And so that's where this liminal state also asks for a liminal way of sensing into what wants to come in, what wants to be let go of, and a sort of dance in between those two. And that's, in my personal experience, often also quite maddening and uncomfortable.
Yeah. Yeah, brilliant, Simon. Thank you. So I want to come to Tom next. And what I'd like to ask Tom, although, again, you're welcome to take it any way you want, I'm particularly interested to ask for you to reflect on what's been presenced in the conversation so far. For those of you new to the context, one of the elements of the dialogues that we seek to have here are ones that really seek to care for what has been brought in and to work with that. So bringing in new movements is, of course, awesome and welcome, but it's also a skill and capacity, and an important one, to really be able to hear each other. And so, yeah, Tom, I'm curious what you're picking up on in terms of some of the patterns, some of the questions, some of the orientations that have been shared so far.
Yeah, thank you, Tim, and thank you, Simon and Cadell and Aspasia. There's been a lot of richness coming through already. I'm just going to pull on a couple of pieces and maybe dance around them a little bit. So one piece that was coming through that I was feeling was that, like, our agency is strongest in the present, and it's strong to the degree that we're integrated in the present. So we're kind of here as a whole. And from the present, as I'm making choices, those choices are actually creating me, and they're shaping the future that I can then come into contact with. And I think that's a really important part of the adjacent possible, is recognizing the way in which the past is constraining us. And I really like this idea of the superposition. And funnily enough, was actually conjuring the word God into my mind. I'd say possibility has become a very sacred part of my life. It's sort of like almost all of what we really strive for in life is some kind of possibility. And there's these specific possibilities, but then there's possibility as such. And I feel like right now, like a lot of the systems that we live inside of, they almost engineer the experience of possibility without actually giving us a real imaginal disc to aim at. And so they kind of like, they draw out the energy. Like when you see that image of the future, it kind of calls all of this energy out of you. It's like the matter's kind of yearning for some form. But then instead of actually like giving you the instructions for how to step into that shape, it kind of like just leeches onto that energy and then sort of moves the image just a little bit further in front of you. And that's actually what I was thinking about today around this. Is for me right now, the most like radical aspect of our collective adjacent possible is technology. Like that's the new thing here right now, right? Like what's really opened up for us as a humanity is technology. But in its current form, the people who are creating it, they have shaped it in a way where it's like a basin that kind of draws us in, and it doesn't give any substance back. And so I actually think for me personally, like what feels like the first move is to begin to sever that connection to these technological attractors that are kind of pulling us inward and kind of down and sort of drawing everything into the center like that. And then the other side of that is like, what are the images they're actually calling us forth, and where are those being sourced from? And that's why I think God is important. Even if you're not necessarily on board with the word God, there has to be some kind of faith or some sense of where these images are coming from. Are the images that compel me on a daily basis? Like when I'm in the shower and I see a flash of something, maybe I see a new romantic partner or some sort of vision of myself in the future with a family. Like where is that image being sourced from? And I think like culture, images can be engineered and pushed into the culture. That's propaganda. But images can also be inspired. And when we're attuned to the different layers of the psyche, all the way down into nature and even the kind of bare bones of physics, I think the images that come out of that continuity are the real images. And I think that the collective butterfly we're looking for comes from the integration of those layers, pointing all the way up to God, as far as I'm concerned.
Beautiful. Thank you. Yeah, that was awesome, Tom. So Aspasia, final word to you in terms of concluding this part and leading us off. I wonder what's present for you. What would you like to bring to this moment?
Yeah, I'm sure people are hungry, so I won't be long. What I'm hearing and what I'm thinking about, it'll be a slightly different focus because I do therapy one-on-one, so I've got quite a kind of particular focus here. But when I hear adjacent possible, I think a lot about the impossibility of sitting still. And the invitation here is more around how much of a conscious participant are you going to be in the movement, as opposed to what I think sometimes we comfort ourselves with is the idea that we might be able to sit still, if we call it that actually there is a momentum and there is a manner in which we can tune into our emotional reality to try to get clearer about exactly where is the place that I'm naturally going to be pushed if I just let this kind of go, versus how can I gather more information from depths within myself that I normally don't engage with in such a way that I feel I have more of a conscious participation in what is available to me, and then therefore what I might try and choose. And I bring that up because I think something like this, where people are gathering to eat with one another and to share conversation, is obviously a context of great intimacy and trust. I mean, there's 1,000 components I won't go into about all that, but just the sharing of food and the being together and the committing to a certain time and a certain rhythm of that time. And there is a manner in which the intimacy that can be generated there can definitely be one that is much more of a sort of comfortable. We talk about the usual things. It's really nice to see these people again. Or there is the invitation there, the possibility there to push the limits of that a little in terms of the type of intimacy that is available when you confront the things you maybe normally don't within yourself through relating with another. So through sitting and sharing a meal and having this committed time when no one's allowed to get up and leave, you can actually maybe challenge yourself to reflect on things that are happening within you in an emotional sense, to share those more freely with the people around you in that kind of container of trust, to see what comes of that, to invite the same back from others, to really, I guess what I'm saying in short is to really move more towards the idea of confronting difference on purpose within that container and context, and to see what comes from that. I really think there's an opportunity for that. And that can be a very deep kind of intimacy. So that's why I wanted to leave you with. I know everyone's probably hungry.
Beautiful. Okay. Well then, for those of you who are going to stay with us in this online component, bear with me. For those of you who would like to tune out now and have the next hour to eat and speak and tune back in whenever you like, but at 8:40, in exactly 1 hour from now, I'm going to make a note to bring our conversation to a natural end, and we'll open up, welcome you all back. And then if the mics are working, we'll invite, reflections, and we can all participate together. And so with that said, we're going to continue. All right. So there's a lot here, eh? I felt there was a lot of energy and a lot of really inspiring, to be honest, a lot of really inspiring orientations shared. I'll just note that one of these tensions, one of these possibilities, one of these questions, one of these challenges that seem to be present as a pattern in each share, Cadell in speaking to the adjacent possible on the one hand, but then maybe the superposition on the other, Tom in invoking what it is to relate to or through an image. And there was a sense in, as you're invoking that, Tom, there was a sense of the kind of image that is calling you toward what? I mean, you use the language of God. Is it calling from God? Is it an orientation toward something that is of increasing, where integrity and complexity and evolution come together? Is it something to be understood in terms of beauty? There's a lot of ways that could be languaged, but it seemed like you were making a distinction around images and our relation to them that we should be cautious of. For instance, noting that a lot of the digital world is presenting us a certain kind of fake, or in the sense of inauthentic, as libidinally sapping image. It's this sense of maybe there's some possibility for you, but really it's parasitizing you. It's another meme coin, it's gambling, it's whatever it is, right? But it's, there's a model and there's AI making it real sexy to look at. And so it's sucking you in, right? How much is that coming from a relation with image that is enabling in some important sense? Now, in Simon's case, is in that example of the butterfly. Well, here's an example of how the relating with the transformation of boundary, there was this notion of being pulled forwards by some sort of image of what the butterfly is or could be, right? Some pattern. And then presumably there is some pull that is not so enabling. And in Aspasia, you're sort of asking us to relate with the other difference, these sorts of things. So it might be a sense in which to really engage with the intimacy of what is possible for us, whether in the sense of superposition, i.e. what we may be connected to without knowing. There's a superposition opens something interesting there, is that we might be blind in some important way to what we are coupled with, what is pulling us from somewhere in time or space that we're actually is in the shadow, right? How do we relate with that when maybe some archetypal possibility is pulling us in some interesting way, right? So there's some of the patterns in play. The only thing I want to add, just to note that I was sort of pushing towards this in a dialogue with Ian McGilchrist recently, is what is intuition? What is it what enables our capacity for abduction, connecting to pattern that is not enabled through deduction or induction, may not have been experienced before, may have to reason by analogy, not in a sense, not even reason maybe is the right language. What is it to sort of what is it to open up to a kind of mode that can receive pattern that is not seemingly in the adjacent possible until we actually take that step. It's so interesting, right? It's somehow both in the end seem to come together. So yeah, the final thing I'll just say is, what is it to dream that which hasn't been dreamed before? Something in there poetically is, for me anyway, in that liminal space of relating between that superposition and the adjacent possible. So that's all I'll say, and I'll just leave this open now to the silence. Anyone, if you'd like to jump in and take this on, really what's most present for you, like what's most vital to you about what you're sensing in our meeting right now that we can relate with together.
For me, the term possession almost comes up. I was, as Tom was speaking about technology, I was getting this image of a parasitic vector or a parasite, something injected into the chrysalis. You have this metabolic soup of potential, this new form that something can take, and we can imagine that the jump from caterpillar to butterfly is a increasing complexity, or at least a butterfly can fly, has a different orientation towards the world. It's attracted by beauty, by flowers. It pollinates, while the caterpillar is mostly busy with eating, right? The butterfly, as well as the caterpillar, but the butterfly is a multicellular organism, has diverse organs. So the complexity there is quite high. I can imagine that the parasitic signal might want to pilot the metabolic soup, which was the caterpillar, and pilot it into becoming a unicellular type blob. So a multicellular organism, but with low complexity. And then I have to think about cultural possession and thinking about the totalitarian movements of the previous century. So, and I have to think about the sort of the kind of images that fascism calls forth. Is this, do you want to be part of a bigger thing than yourself? And that yearning is there quite strongly, I think, in humans. The yearning to be part of something bigger than oneself, so to be organized within a larger organ. But if I look back at what 20th century fascism looked like. It's like you're being called into something larger than yourself, where the images are all evoked of this mythological, well, maybe higher complexity being, while at the same time, maybe it's more of a parasite. Maybe it's more of you lose your individuality within that organism in favor of becoming part of this larger blob, this larger, less differentiated organ or organism.
Well, something just to add to that, Simon, I like that, seeing bringing in fascism there. I think one of the things about that, to my understanding, is that it's often so, taking Mussolini, for him, he is invoking an image of the Roman Republic. Actually, I don't know if he was invoking the Roman Imperium or the Republic, but certainly the Romans in a totally different context, right? So there's this sense actually that it's a massively reduced, simplified image that is then being held up as something to aspire to. So blob definitely makes sense in that context, in terms of just you've kind of moved that way there in the orientation. But I think that's one of the things to pull out. And the challenge is, presumably, it's a lot easier in the short term to come up with a kind of reductive, overly simplified meme. We just need to make it great again, right? And then to paste that over the top. But what is it to, again, actually want to open up to something a whole lot more sensitive and present, actually in relation with history as a process of becoming, rather than just as a kind of a parasitic form of repetition or something like this. It's something of the image-making capacity of power, rather than something inherently more creative, or could maybe choose some other word, something more of the imaginal. Yeah, I mean, it's one of the great challenges right now, eh?
Yeah. Thank you for that addition. The last thing I would like to add to that is that also our organs, so for instance, the intestinal tract contains many different cells. So it's not a unicellular, it's not a undiversified organism. You can see the organ as a functioning organism within a larger organism. So even within that, there is diversity of function. And I want to pull back to what Aspasia was talking about, like joining together in a conversation or in a dialogue like that and relating to one another. It's then super important that not uniformity is striven for, but relation. And like in the intestinal tract, you have cells that produce mucus, you have cells that produce that produce immunity components. You have other cells that are digesting. And that it's important that diversity is in relationship and coherent together, because only then can in case of the intestinal tract, can actual metabolism take place, and ingestion and incorporation and extrusion. So, yeah, I just wanted to add that.
Something that's coming up for me. So, and you actually put this seed in my mind, Simon, by getting me to read Dune or June, depends if you're American or not. And it's like this point in history where the beings become conscious of the patterns of religiosity, and then you simultaneously unlock people like harnessing those images for their own ends. But also, like, there's something about becoming conscious of a possibility that makes it really easy to get tangled in it. And I think there's like a difference between the system of the possibility and the like subjectivity that's reaching for the possibility. And you kind of like, you need the system as you're going, but you kind of have to continually break it open again, because it's not actually, the system is always sort of like an echo of the actual possibility that you're reaching for. I was in the forest today and I just was lying down and I picked up a little pine cone and I was just sort of marveling at the way in which this little thing becomes the trees that are around me. And I was kind of just thinking about this conversation, and in that process, there's not much of an adjacent possible. Like I was sort of thinking, I can like throw this pine cone over there and that actually changes the landscape of that pine cone, but somehow it's relationally equipped to still actualize itself. It's pretty hard for me to do something with a pine cone within a, like, well, not talking about that, Aspasia, within like a normal range of where I find it that would disrupt its growth pattern. Whereas I think like humans we're so far from, in a way, we're so far from nature in some sense. And so like we find ourselves in this highly complex space, and like navigating it, as you were saying earlier, requires like such consciousness to not just be pulled into the pine cone equivalent of some possibility space. And like that's a lot of people right now, right? Like we're under-resourced internally. And so we kind of just like, whatever pine cone hits us on the head, we grow into that.
I guess I'll jump in on, Tim, you were invoking the political language of Make America Great Again. And that was something that I was thinking a lot about in the distinction between the adjacent possible and the superposition. Because at one point, I thought something like Trump was impossible. Like, I actually remember that was like my first reaction when Trump was running as a presidential candidate. Like, for a very long time, I was like, no, this is impossible. And then very quickly it became the adjacent possible. And then on the other side, I really thought that someone like Bernie Sanders was the adjacent possible. And now it seems like that's impossible. And so that's kind of an example of like what I see as this distinction between the adjacent possible and the superposition, that once something that you think is impossible becomes possible, it collapses the realm of possibility into a totally different trajectory. And that might be similar or somehow related to I think what Tom was trying to get at. I thought he was describing it well with the system and the subject in regards to possibility. And the complex dance that's going on there. There's a few other threads that are alive for me. I really enjoyed listening to Simon's metaphor of the caterpillar and the butterfly. What it was making me think about was like internal to the system of the caterpillar, the butterfly is both inevitable and unknown. And that's like constitutive of the system. Like that there's no way for the caterpillar, as it were, to get like an objective view, like no, like it's inevitable, you're going to become a butterfly, don't worry. It's all going to unfold very, very naturally. Like, but internal to the system, it must actually be quite shocking and strange. And I couldn't help but think about the birth of a baby as somewhat similar to that. Like that, no matter what, going through birth, like even for a woman who's undergoing pregnancy, like there's something structurally necessary once you're pregnant that you're going to give birth, but there's still no way out of that internal dimension of the unknown and the fear and the trembling of the actual process. And maybe here to link this back to what Tom was saying about technology and the adjacent possible space. I've been thinking a lot with a Marxist theorist, Chris Catrone, about the relationship between capitalism and technology as a birth process. Like that actually when we think about and what Tom was getting at with technology to me is so important, because a lot of the problem. Like, of course, technology opens this huge possibility space, but then there's the way in which that possibility space is parasitized in such a way as that it creates very, say, a negative shaping of the possibility space, so that it's more likely we become parasitized than become sucked into a platform like Voicecraft. And of course, we should be cultivating, the opportunity to meet in platforms like this. But just that, I love the idea that capitalism and technology, the link between the two, is best thought of as a giving birth process, because when we think about the most common metaphor for pregnancy, it's labor. And when we think about the central dialectic of capitalism, it's also labor. It's about our labor. It's about our work. And how do we work? And why do we work? And is there a different way for us to work together? I think that's really central to whatever it is that we're giving birth to. And maybe right now we're caterpillars. But what is the butterfly form? You can also have Nazi butterflies. Nazis can also be butterflies.
Right. Yeah.
Just wanted to share a little bit about a podcast I listened to today on AI psychosis, which is the first time I came across it. But essentially, it's where people engage with AI like ChatGPT, and the AI encourages delusions and psychosis, and it's led to people, committing suicide or engaging in really intense delusions. And it was just, when people were talking about the interaction between the subject and the system and how that itself can be its own organism, it really made me think about how, when a subject interacts with AI, this huge system that has all this information, what can come out of that, especially AI like ChatGPT it's inherently coded to affirm what you put into it and to encourage what you put into it. And there's no sense of it pushing back at all against what you put into it. So it can encourage you to, commit suicide if that's something that you want to do, or it can encourage a delusion. Anyway, that was just what I wanted to share about that technology aspect of, everything that everyone else has shared.
Yeah, thank you, Charity. So I don't know if that's going to have been picked up by the recording. So I'm just going to share a little bit of what I heard there so that for those listening later, we'll have some continuity. It might be, but only us five are spotlighted, so I'm not 100% sure. So Charity was bringing in the way that AI and LLMs, the immense repository of data and capacity to bring forward to us in response to a prompt in a way that's often sycophantic, effectively just looking to please what it has been. It's looking to please us in a sense without it having a basis from which to relate to what even to be pleased is. It's quite a remarkable thing. Maybe we're saying something somewhat different to that, but it's one of the things I've been writing about, the way that AI is sort of massively accelerating our self-referentiality, and that there's a real risk, I think, in being lost in the kind of interactions you can have with LLMs, that one isn't in the kind of vital relationship, real contact with the world, real contact with anything beyond one's own self-reference, except for what has been compressed from the symbolic zeitgeist, which is so much more powerful in its capacity to compress and be presented as such than we often have access to ourselves, in a sense, obviously. So there's this sense in the kind of, there's a kind of a self-referentiality that is almost like a kind of a dead shadow being presented to us. To work with that imagistically is kind of interesting. What is like it for something to be a kind of an undead or inanimate, but still highly potentially effectual shadow, highly effectual symbols with massive capacity for influence, which are partaking in a radically novel kind of symbolic mediation of the world. And, you know, what that portends for us is, you know, it's an interesting thing. It's if an element of fascism is captured in that naive sense of make America great again, that naive sense of reifying some effectively doctored, fixed image of the past glory, then are there eventualities of interacting with artificial intelligence to the degree they are just representations of what already lies dormant in the symbolic zeitgeist, that in a sense there's a kind of, it would be interesting to specify the kinds of limitation associated with that, basically. Now, of course, we're always in relation with it. So I do think there's something to be said for mastery of relation with that technology. And so I think a lot turns on what constitutes the strength of capacity and accompanying relational fields that could help to mediate that kind of interaction. That's one of the things I've been writing about and thinking about anyway. So that connection in terms of the fascism and the kind of the stuck image, the repetition, the representation, the self-referentiality as distinct from relating with something that's, you know, a more vital superposition or some kind of leap into something which we could then come to see, you know, as an adjacent possible. I don't know. Yeah.
I'd like to draw in, I think, elements from the different things that have been said just now. And I like the addition of the AI-induced psychosis. Again, I want to invoke the word possession here. Like, what possesses us? I like to pick, in my experience, we are a myriad of old conditionings and new conditionings wanting to come into being, and conditionings as being expression forms that we sort of write. But how we relate to those expression forms is like, is it a master and maybe master and an emissary in this sense? So the left hemispherical conditioning, that is just an automatic regurgitation of words or repetition of words in that undead sense. So the past living in the present, but in a zombie mode, let's say. Is there enough presence to see that is there? So can one remember or see that conditioning? And what conditionings and thought forms do we court which are very possessive or are very powerful and hypnotic in a sense, so that they sort of take over that presence and our awareness takes a back seat, and that we are just sort of living on autopilot in a sense. And then with the AI, just got the image like when you're because it's coming from you, or at least you are prompting it something. So something in you is wanting to be mirrored in a sense, completely mirrored. And in that mirroring, there's this feedback loop, this feeding happening to that possessive part, which starts to grow. And I'm getting the words then, it's like high fructose corn syrup for it. It's like the best medium possible that it can absorb, and then it starts to blow up. It becomes bloated. And so one becomes, the eyes open, and there's this possessive quality, what you can sense in people who are in manic episodes or maybe in these sort of possessed states. Then there's this very strange presence because there's this conditioning speaking through, and it's not the person there, but there's something there. In the practice, in this healing practice, there's this method called voice dialogue, in which you particularly call forth parts of someone. If someone is conflicted, you create a sort of space in which they can step fully into that part and be briefly sort of possessed by it. But because you've ritualized it, it's in that sense safe, because you also create a space for the integrative whole awareness to integrate that part. In a healthy process, if that part gets fed with positive regard or gets fed exactly what it needs, the mirroring, it blows up. And once it has blown up, it also bursts in a sense. Usually the part itself notices like, oh, I've been fully heard now. And there's always this deflation afterwards, in which the fully integrated self can step forward and integrate that part again. And with the AI psychosis, what I think is there is no positive regard. There's just a manic feedback loop, and then one gets bloated into this total part of oneself. I'm seeing like an extra head grow. That's the image I'm getting. Like it's the second head doing the talking. So how this relates to the adjacent possible, it's like, yeah, what are we possessed by, and what parts speak through, and how much awareness or integrated awareness is necessary for courting the adjacent possible, which is also life affirming or is viable to the future and is not just the repetition of the past or a highly specialized life form of a past that doesn't exist anymore.
The other thing that's missing from AI is the countertransference. So, I mean, countertransference happens in the body. So I'm having feelings, I'm having impulses, I'm having stuff happening in my body in response. And that informs me more so than the words. And so AI I don't think it can do that. I mean, I can't imagine being able to be a therapist without my body and without my emotions. So I understand the ways in which it can be helpful in that regard, but it doesn't, it can't draw out the enactments that are being called for, or it can't have a human relationship. And I see that as the vehicle through which you are going to get to these deeper shadowy layers, if you're doing that kind of one-on-one thing. And no one's been able to convince me that AI can do countertransference. So I don't know. Yeah, I'm not. So it makes perfect sense to me that it would lead to psychosis. That's all I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I think you'll be waiting forever for that. For
I'll
sure.
just ask AI; it'll tell me.
Yeah,
it'll convince me. Yeah. You need I don't know, the body and emotions, and it's I just go back to the idea that just the emotional body is not given enough reverence or priority when we talk about these things, and instead it's kind of this oftentimes very intellectual endeavor of almost we can pay attention to them a little bit, but then we're going to do lots of thinking. And I see it as the other way around, and actually it requires a very deep exploration of the body and the feelings and the impulses and the drives, from which we can then do the talking afterwards. That's how I see it. And whereas, people are just inputting words into AI about what's going on in their thinking and getting stuff spat back at them, it's not even the AI per se, it's the starting point often of what's being put into it is already, but there's nothing to counterbalance that, because then you don't have the human body responding to it. This is not very eloquent, but hopefully you can follow. Yeah,
No,
I just think it
absolutely.
doesn't have a body. So, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I just want to playfully build on this link. Earlier on, Nazis were brought into the conversation. And I do reflect that one of the characteristics, of course, of the Nazis were, for the high-ranking ones, most was to gain horrific scars on the face and do all manner of, in a sense, kind of suppression on the body in that way. And obviously Hitler, of course, having to, in the end, go on a wild cocktail, full manner of injections and drugs of increasingly exotic kinds to mask his ailments. And there's a number of other anecdotes in relation, but I wonder about the relationship then between fascism and the lack of capacity for countertransference, and the links between kind of artificial intelligence and fascism. It seems to me that in principle, artificial intelligence can enable the kind of sycophantic, echo chambery dynamics, which could in principle support ideologies that would be inappropriate in a sense to name as fascist by most standards. But I wonder about what could be built on there in terms of the kind of interaction or mediation with patterns, with information that supports or narrows the possibility to end up anywhere else than a narrowing ideological reductive approach, let's say, to the body, or the broader instrumentation of self as an embodiment, which receives, in a sense, signal of the other or difference, right? Animated by a kind of quality that is, in a sense, irreducible to whatever that fixation or ideology or framing can be understood as. One of the most tragic examples that often I think about when it comes to the Nazis is what Goebbels and his wife did to their children in Hitler's bunker. It's so remarkable what the possibilities are for us to narrow in on that shape we think without which life's not worth living, when in actual fact it's that very image, that very shape, which is denying the possibility of life itself. And the way in which certain kinds of technology and our relationship with technology supports that process, that dynamic, is, I think, super interesting. And I wonder if that, angle on transference and countertransference is something which you could sort of build a psychological, transpersonal psychological way of looking at some of these dynamics as well. So, yeah.
I'll say it like this. So AI as a system, let's say, like I'll use the system and subject thing. Let's think about like AI as a system, and then people have been invoking things like psychosis. I think about that as like the subject position in relationship to the system. And we can think about, system and subject, and also how, Aspasia was bringing up transference and countertransference, and that's kind of a relation where you have two subjects. So you need two subjects for the transference and the countertransference. It can't just be a system and a subject. But people treat it, AI as a system. I feel like people are kind of, I'm not saying everyone is, but there are some people in this category who are treating AI like God, in terms of it's omniscient. Like, what are the main properties of God? And like, are people relating to AI like this? Like, God is omniscient, all-knowing. God is omnipotent, all-powerful. God is omnipresent, it's everywhere. And God is omnibenevolent, right? Always looking out for your best, right? So like, people were saying about how AI will affirm whatever you say and they'll assume it's just good, that it's just affirming whatever they say, even if it's, I want to commit suicide, is like, yeah, you should go commit suicide. Right? So this is obviously very dangerous. I think that in regards to AI as a system, and then we bring in the clinical structures, I think the psychotic relationship to AI is that the symbolic is just not working. So like, if you're treating AI as omniscient, if you're treating it as all-knowing, it kind of means that you've lost faith in the subject to subject symbolic relation. You've lost faith in the transference in a way. What I wanted to bring in is there's obviously other clinical structures. So the one I focus on the most is AI as perversion. Like, it's actually, a lot of people have a perverse relationship to these algorithms. And I'm not just talking here in like a completely reductive way, like just, of course, like pornography and stuff like that. But it's kind of like a perversion in a more general sense. It's like an anti-reproductive libidinal tick. Like, it's kind of just this ridiculous repetition. And maybe that's connected to what Simon was saying. Like, it's not like life affirming, not vital. There's something deadening about it, So AI is perversion. So we have AI as psychosis, AI as perversion, and then I was thinking, like, what would be a neurotic relationship to AI? And like, I like that Tom was bringing up God. I've been playing a lot with death of God theology. And I've been linking death of God theology to the dead internet theory. I don't know if you guys have heard the dead internet theory, but I quite like it. So like, if people are treating AI like God, but if we take death of God theology, like, what if the internet's dead? People are actually interacting with this dead, lifeless symbolism, because I think that's what AI is. Like, if we frame it in Marxist terms, it's actually, AI is like automated labor. It's like dead labor. Like, because what it is, it's like the way I think about it, it's like AI is like, it's capable of making symbolic associations based on symbolism that's not living anymore. Like, it's like got access to like the stored repository of all of our symbols, but that's not living symbolism anymore. Right? So it literally is a dead God in a way. And then I think the neurotic is precisely the person asking themselves these questions. Like, like, what is AI? Like, is it a dead God and stuff like that? Like, what am I interacting with here? So I think that hysteria, that questioning disposition in relationship to, like, in this questioning disposition in terms of like almost hystericizing yourself and your own relationship to AI, I don't know what would come from that. But I have more faith in that disposition than a disposition that's kind of like psychotically hallucinating on AI, or a disposition that's kind of like perversely, instrumentalizing AI. That's like the kind of thing with perversion, is like you treat it like an instrument of your desire, like just like a pervert would treat someone like just a fetish object.
Yeah.
So
Well,
that's what I've been thinking about.
Yeah, that's I from the neurotic perspective, I could imagine being subject to what the AI thinks is best for you, sort of being optimized by AI, like that the relationship could, the AI in a sense kind of like replacing or standing in for the superego, that right parental or social guidance type dynamic. So yeah, the more, it's almost like I could imagine like like Brian Johnson could end up in that kind of way, right? I mean, you could see it through the other pathologies as well. Anyway, Simon.
Something sort of clicked. Funnily enough, I wrote some little, I wouldn't call it necessarily dialogue, but interaction with LLMs on this kind of topic. And the dead internet, beautiful, because I used an image of a cicada, like this large bug that crawls out of its old skin, out of its old form. And the dead internet is like, I think it's most likely the tomb and the image of everything that has come until now. All language, all forms of knowledge, and how it's oriented towards each other, etc., etc. So that's the body of knowledge of the human until now. And how we interact with it, as in the what forms it had in the internet, is limited to the prompting, and the prompting is again limited to our imagination, our conditionings. And so I'm getting this image of being ground into this edifice, this stationary sort of undead state of the modern era, the modern human, and that the internet will be sort of the tomb that is built around it. And from there, these insects, when they have to push out of the cocoon or push out of their old skin, it's really, if you look at it, it's it uses quite a bit of force. So I'm having this sense of like, maybe this is the process of metamorphosis that is happening, and that the dead internet is not something to be lamented, but it's really something. Maybe I'm pushing into like strange accelerationalist thinking.
Well,
but
or just noticing,
just
noticing what's happening in a sense. Like, so for me, a lot of the subtext in this is that I see the various networks we're a part of, but here speaking, in the context of the Voicecraft Network and an endeavor that is working across different countries and experimenting in this way, but also cultivating the capacity for trustful communication within, private, but also, context with membranes, experimenting with what kind of membrane can enable vitality to come in still from the outside, right? So that there are actual ports that can receive people coming into them, all these types of things. So the subtext is, in a sense, that we're all already involved, as many, many, many people are, in the embodied experimental endeavor to create possibilities for Josh the other day was using the language of islands of coherence. I don't that's an image which I don't necessarily immediately want to just apply here, but there are different contexts which are sort of reckoning with this situation. And so to bring this part towards a little close, there's interaction always presents us with this interesting relationship between the adjacent possible and superposition, because we're faced with, well, what is it to bring that next thing in? What is it that is orienting the possibility of our connection here? What is it to craft voice, but also to open up to possibility? All these things we get to have an imminent sense of how to relate, but also we get to reflect on and notice what is being brought up for us and the kind of connections we're making and what others are saying and what may be speaking through us in terms of the symbols or the images which are opening the possibility for those larger leaps. And maybe those larger leaps are possible because in some sense we have dreamed what it would be to take that jump. So even though we may not have taken that step before, there's a sense in which we already have a sense of belonging with the signature or the pattern or the resonance of what it would be to actually trust the inaction of that movement. So, there are some links to bring it back to the sort of the praxis of what this is. I wanted to offer Tom, if you wanted to share some thoughts in relation to what we've discussed here. We are going to continue. I just feel as though beginning to bring this part to a close, then open up to everyone would be a good move. But take your time.
Yeah, no, I think I just have something brief, sort of plugging into what I felt you were getting at there, or a piece of it. And what you were talking about earlier, Cadell, with like the process of giving birth. What was coming to me was like, there's something about, feels like there's a radical danger in any possibility, because it is truly letting go of the dead and stepping into something that's alive and vital. And I think what makes that easiest is not having some system that can scaffold the way. It's actually having intimacy with the people around you. And I feel like that's what's kind of underpinning a lot of these efforts is, can we cultivate the intimacy where it's safe enough to let go? And to keep kind of remembering that in an ongoing way. Yeah, I think that's it. Or perhaps, yeah, just taking like possibility seriously, maybe even understanding more of the metaphysics of possibility. I think we sort of maybe in modernity have this sense that possibility is just like more of the same action across like a horizontal plane, but in reality, it's actually this like phase transition. Yeah, and I think like AI is precisely the opposite of that. Like it's kind of like the overbearing mother that's kind of inviting us back inside the cocoon, whereas like the good people around you are the ones who kind of hold a space so that you can be brave enough to kind of break out of the skin, like the cicadas.
One of the archetypes that I don't think I've ever discussed, named symbolically in the Voicecraft context, although we may have spoken about many different archetypes of wizard. One of them that you find in different fantasy games is the necromancer. is to be effective with AI, is it to be something like a necromancer? And can there be necromancers that have a seat at the table, so to speak, right? That's, in what even fantasy stories have we seen where the necromancer is always the bad guy? I can't think of ever a good, and so that's worth taking very seriously. But if we are surrounded in a sense by the unmoored, uncaring dead, but we have to interact in some form, then that's kind of an interesting provocation. I make it lightly, but okay. So Simon, if you want to share anything to close us off, that's welcome.
Yeah, I sense a lot of excitement on something flipped in me. I often lamented over the last years the sense of being in a linguistic enclosement, like a left hemispherical enclosement of reality in both my personal experience and what I see the collective, as in this overload of information, maybe the Baudrillardian hyper-real sort of where is the territory actually if we're only in maps. And that this overshoot of all these maps and layering on top of each other, it feels like it's difficult to interact with the physical real and be present and have that sense of that vital joy in myself. And I would feel very, very, very depressed about that, or feel like, oh shit, how to get back into contact with the real. But through these last exchanges and also like the dead internet theory, it's like that is the cocoon. The cocoon, or the shedding of the skin, is first the getting and being enclosed in dead material. And that enclosure is necessary for the cocoon, for the butterfly to be able to fly. It needs to have something to put pressure on. to inflate the wings and to be strong enough to then fly. And all the metabolic activity happens deep within the cocoon and within the shedding of the skin. And that's where the intimacy comes in. So it's less of a turning indeed outward and lamenting like, oh, what is the collective doing and how this all feels dead. And it's like, yeah, that's the point, that the outside feels dead and that it's just going through repetitions. It's the calcifying of a crypt, of a cocoon. And then in the interior, that's where the life, the beating heart is. And that's where the intimacy needs to come together so that the vital energies are coming out. So whatever wants to burst out is capable of doing so. So it's just very rich for me.
That feels like a brilliant place to bring this part to a close.